Necromancy was created in the ancient kingdom of Nehekhara, when a priest of the mortuary cult tortured dark elf prisoners until they revealed secrets the cult had pursued for centuries without success, combining their forbidden knowledge of dark magic with the death rituals of his own priesthood to forge something that had never existed before and should not have been possible, a form of sorcery that would eventually spawn every vampire, every skeleton army, every ghost and ghoul and wight that has ever walked the Warhammer world, all of it traceable back to one man's refusal to accept that death could claim him, and that man was Nagash. The civilization that created him would be the first thing necromancy destroyed, an entire kingdom poisoned and raised from the dead, its greatest hero armed with a sword forged by rats who were terrified of what they had helped create. And even that death would not matter, because the mechanisms built to preserve the Necromancer had already made certain that death could never hold him. The resentment that fed necromancy into existence began before any magic was learned, before anyone was tortured, before anything was built. Nehekhara operated on rules where firstborn sons were given to the mortuary cult and second sons became kings, which meant the firstborn son of King Hetep of Khemri lost his throne to a younger brother named Thutep, while the priesthood consumed what should have been a ruler. The resentment had a deeper root that preceded even the priesthood. Before the mortuary cult claimed him, the firstborn had accompanied his father Ketep on a campaign against the Lizardmen, threatening the allied city of Libaris. And when Ketep fell ill during the war, the son took command of the army, pursuing the enemy for months until their leader was dead and the campaign won. For 6 months, the fortress city of Resetra answered to the firstborn as a king in all but name, its walls and garrisons held in an iron grip, the taste of power settling into bone. When Ketep recovered, he gave Resetra to one of his generals and brought his son back to Khemri, forbidding anyone to speak of the brief rule, rewriting the official history to call the firstborn a brave warrior and nothing more. The throne earned through blood was given to a subordinate, while the son who won it was given to priests who spent their lives preparing corpses for tombs, and that theft traveled with him into every decision he would make for the next several thousand years. The mortuary cult existed for one purpose. Setra the Imperishable, the greatest king Nehekhara had ever known, had commanded them to discover the secret of immortality so that he might rule forever. And for generations the cult had labored in the necropolises beneath the desert cities, perfecting the arts of preservation and mummification, while the true prize remained beyond their grasp. The priesthood could not deliver what Setra demanded, because it would not cross the lines required to reach it, lines that the youngest high priest in the cult's history had no intention of respecting. The knowledge required to cross those lines arrived when a dark elf ship blown off course was captured by the navy of Xandri. Its crew offered as sacrificial slaves to be entombed in the pyramid of the recently deceased king. Among the prisoners was a sorceress who knew things about magic that no human had ever learned, secrets of the Chaos Gate in the far north, where the winds of magic blew into the world, techniques for channeling power directly rather than begging it from gods. The pyramid that held the elves was riddled with lethal traps that only the high priest knew how to navigate, and the bargain offered inside those corridors was no bargain at all. Teach the secrets, and the safe paths would be revealed. Refuse, and the traps would find them. The sorceress revealed that mortals could wield magic directly without divine intercession, showed how pain and death could be harvested to fuel sorcery, explained Warpstone, the solidified essence of chaos that could amplify magical power beyond anything the mortuary cult had achieved. When the knowledge was exhausted, the elves were disposed of, the sorceress blinded, her tongue and hands removed, buried alive in the pyramid where she had spent years as a prisoner because the dead could not demand their secrets back. The fusion that followed created something neither tradition had imagined. Necromancy was not simply dark magic and not simply death ritual, but a combination that allowed the caster to command the dead directly, to raise corpses as servants, to extend life indefinitely through an elixir brewed from human blood, and the elixir became the chain that bound nobles to the service of whoever held the formula, binding them because only Nagash knew how to brew it. One night, when clouds covered the sky over Khemri, the younger brother Thutep was sealed inside his father's tomb. the throne claimed by the firstborn, who had waited decades for what he believed was already his. Khemri transformed under the Necromancer's rule into something the other city-states of Nehekhara had never seen. Fear replacing custom as the organizing principle, a coterie of nobles participating in necromantic experiments, while Archon, who would become known as Archon the Black, died and returned at his master's command, and a state that now ran on death required a machine to concentrate it. Therefore, the Black Pyramid consumed 50 years of slave labor, its dark stone rising above every other monument in Nehekhara, designed not as a tomb, but as a magical engine that would channel the winds of magic and amplify the power of whoever controlled it tenfold, until the elderly architect came to announce its completion and received Archon's blade across his throat. Because that engine made power both unprecedented and fragile, and because defeat would scatter rather than erase what had been built, he wrote the 9 books in human skin and illuminated them with human blood, each volume binding a fragment of his soul into its pages, so that complete understanding would remain beyond any single reader, the knowledge deliberately fractured across all 9. And once knowledge was no longer contained in one man, it could be misread by others. Therefore, those books escaped their creator, stolen by Lamashizar of Lamaya, and centuries later, Neferata studied them in Lamia and accidentally created something the original Necromancer had never imagined. The first vampires, a new species of undead born from a flawed attempt to replicate the immortality elixir. Creatures that craved blood, burned in sunlight, and could spread their curse through bites. As necromancy spread beyond Khemri in distorted form, its consequences became impossible to ignore. Therefore, the other kingdoms of Nehekhara watched with growing horror as the dead walked in service to the throne, and the living died to fuel experiments. The covenant between civilization and its gods beginning to fray under blasphemies the divine powers could not tolerate. The crisis could not be resolved by armies alone, because the breach with the gods ran through a single person. Therefore, Nephilim became the obstacle that violence could not remove. The royal court of Lamia had sent her to marry Thutep, according to a tradition that began with Setra himself, where the king of Khemri took a wife from the Lamian bloodline known as the Daughter of the Sun, a woman who served as the physical embodiment of the covenant between Nehekhara and its gods. The usurper had desired her since he first saw her, but she rejected him utterly, hating him for murdering her husband, controlled only by threats against her son Sukhet. When the boy became more useful, dead than alive, the young prince was murdered and an elixir brewed from his blood, then brought to Nephilim with an offer to end her suffering, a promise that Sukhet would not be harmed from that moment forward. The cup held what she believed was poison, not the elixir made from her own son's blood, not the knowledge that Sukhet was already dead when the promise was sworn. The elixir bound her in a state between life and death, and in doing so, that sacred bond was unknowingly severed, cutting the priests off from the divine power they had relied upon for centuries. When Nephilim was forced to walk through the magical wards defending Mahrak during the siege, the defensive lightning burning her to ash, the detonation shattered not only the city's defenses, but the last connection between Nehekhara and the gods who had protected it since the time of Setra. The other city-states finally united, Libaris bringing new technologies, while Rasetra contributed soldiers hardened by constant warfare, with lizardmen, and Lamia sent warriors armed with dragon staves, purchased from distant Cathay. The skeleton armies raised to defend Khemri marched to war in numbers the world had never seen, the sight of the dead advancing causing hundreds of enemy soldiers to flee in terror. But the living rallied despite their fear, the combined forces of 7 kingdoms pushing into Khemri, until Archon gave his life defending the throne, and the Necromancer was driven from his own capital, his body broken, the Black Pyramid left standing as a monument to what had failed. The first death did not take. The kings of Nehekhara burned everything the usurper had created, executing followers, and consigning the 9 books to flames, or so they believed, not knowing that Lamashizar of Lamia had stolen several volumes and hidden them away for study. The northeastern wastes received what Khemri had expelled, the necromancer's physical form decaying while his spirit refused to release its grip on existence. The point of death came in those deserts, with only warpstone deposits discovered at Cripple Peak sustaining what should have ended. the concentrated chaos energy transforming a withered corpse into something far worse. The chaos-touch substance changed everything, increasing his size until he towered over mortal men, burning away remaining flesh until little more than a walking skeleton wreathed in dark energy remained, amplifying his magical power beyond anything achieved in Khemri, while stripping away the last traces of his humanity. Nagash rose within the mountain at Cripple Peak under his command, a fortress city designed to inspire terror, its highest peak serving as a tower, while slaves mined the warpstone deposits that fed the power growing inside it. Tunnels broke into the mountain from below in search of the substance, hordes of ratmen pouring through to claim what had been found, and the war between fortress and tunnel lasted for years until both sides realized neither could destroy the other. The truce offered raw ore in exchange for slaves, and the Skaven accepted because they wanted what Cripple Peak contained more than they feared what the labor they provided would be used for. Centuries passed while Nehekara continued without its exiled tyrant, the city-states returning to their old rivalries, the mortuary cult forbidden from developing new magic, the memory of the usurper fading into a cautionary tale told to frighten children. The second invasion brought vampires, the descendants of Neferata's flawed experiments, who had fled the destruction of Lamia and found their way to Nagash, serving as captains, leading armies of skeletons against the living kingdoms. But Nehekara had changed in the intervening centuries, and Alcadizar had united the city-states into something that could resist. The war ground on for years until the decision was made that if Nehekara could not be ruled, it would be destroyed entirely. Poison entered the river Vitae from the tunnels, contaminating the great waterway that sustained every city in the kingdom, and plague spread through the population, while Nagash waited for its enemies to weaken. The kingdom died around Alcadizar in stages, the plague taking his wife and children first, then his armies, then everything that had made Nehekara worth defending, until nothing remained but corpses and the few survivors too stubborn to flee. The forces from Nagash captured him and dragged him in chains to the fortress, where the great Necromancer kept him alive to witness what came next. The accumulated power of the Black Pyramid tore through the staff forged to tap its energies as the Necromancer unleashed it, channeling the warpstone of Cripple Peak and the deaths of millions of Nehekarans whose souls had been harvested as they perished from the plague. The spell washed across the desert kingdom like a tide of dark energy carrying the Necromancer's will, caring nothing for walls or distance or sanctuary, penetrating every tomb and every burial ground, touching every corpse that had ever been interred according to the rites of the mortuary cult. Everything that drew breath died, and everything that had ever been buried rose from its tomb. The desert fell silent for the first time in millennia, the living gone, the dead standing in rows that stretched to every horizon. The risen dead were meant to become an army of millions under his command, a force that would march on the world and could never be depleted because every enemy killed would join its ranks, and nothing in the world could have stopped it. The Skaven saved everyone by accident. Beneath the earth, the tunnels that fed Nagash with warpstone and slaves carried warnings back to the Council of 13, whose warrens would be among the first to suffer when the army marched north. The Fellblade took shape in the forges below, pure warpstone hammered into a weapon so toxic it would kill its wielder along with its target, and Alcadizar was freed from his cell with the sword pressed into his hands, pointed toward the throne room where the great Necromancer sat weakened from the exertion of the ritual. Alcadizar found what the ritual had left behind, cutting off the hand that reached for him before carving through the dark magic hurled in defense, the Skaven channeling their own power to protect him even as the effort killed members of the council one by one, hacking apart what remained piece by piece until nothing survived but scattered bones. The bones burned in warpstone fire, their ashes scattered across the world so that nothing could reassemble. The right hand crawled away during the battle, but the great Necromancer was believed to be finally destroyed. The dead of Nehekara rose as commanded, but without the will that should have bound them, they retained their own minds. The ancient kings woke in their tombs, confused and furious. served by the mortuary cult priests who had finally achieved the immortality Settra had demanded. The attempt to create an army had instead created the Tomb Kings, an entire civilization of undead who hated the Necromancer for what he had done to their land. The Black Pyramid served as the anchor, feeding power into scattered fragments for 1,111 years until regeneration was complete and Nehekhara proved to be defended by the very army raised to conquer it, led by Settra himself, who drove the returning horror back to Nagash with contempt. The crown of sorcery had traveled north during the long absence, falling into the hands of a tribal king named Sigmar, who was uniting the human tribes into what would become the Empire. The crown's influence made Sigmar gaunt and paranoid, turning him against allies until his companion Wulfgart knocked the artifact from his head and broke its hold. The march on the nascent empire to reclaim the crown raised armies of the dead from every barrow and burial mound between Nagash and the lands of men. At the Battle of the River Reich outside the walls of Reichdorf, Sigmar faced the great Necromancer directly, while the dead clawed their way up from the earth even within the city itself, rising in the streets, rising in the houses, rising everywhere the dark magic touched. Sigmar wore the crown into battle because it offered some protection against the sorcery thrown at him, but even shielded the sheer power of what he faced was overwhelming. Visions of a future where the dead ruled in peace flooded his mind, where the endless wars of men would finally cease, where his own descendants would slaughter in his name. Sigmar denied the vision and fought, losing ground until he threw down the crown and raised Galmaraz to destroy it. The Necromancer lunged for the crown instead of finishing the killing blow, the obsession with artifacts overriding any tactical sense, and in that moment of distraction, the rune-forged hammer crushed the skull that had terrorized two civilizations. The second death held for 1,666 years, ending during the Night of the Restless Dead, and the pattern would continue again and again because the mechanisms built to prevent permanent destruction had been designed to outlast any weapon brought against their creator. The Black Pyramid anchored the soul to the mortal world, a structure designed from the beginning, not as a tomb, but as a phylactery on a scale no other necromancer had ever attempted. The 9 books carried fragments of essence woven into the human skin pages, which meant that as long as any volume survived, some part of what had written them would persist. The crown of sorcery bound a portion of power, allowing influence over whoever wore it, sight through their eyes, whispers in their thoughts. The severed hand crawled through the world on skeletal fingers, eventually becoming the claw of Nagash, an artifact of terrible power that sought reunion with its source. The sword Mortis, forged in Nagash from warpstone and dark iron, carried malevolence into battle even when wielded by other hands. Every artifact created, every book written, every monument built served as a tether preventing the spirit from passing beyond reach. The vampires spread across the world carrying diluted versions of the stolen knowledge, establishing bloodlines that would plague the living for millennia. The Tomb Kings guarded Nehekhara against any who would disturb the dead, including the Necromancer himself when he returned to claim what he still considered his. The 9 books surfaced and resurfaced throughout history, corrupting everyone who studied them, spreading necromancy to practitioners who had no idea they were using fragments of one man's research. During the end times, when chaos rose to consume the world, Arkan the Black and Manfred von Karstein performed the ritual to resurrect Nagash fully. The wind of death itself was absorbed, the incarnate of Shyish emerging as something between a lich and a god that transcended mortality entirely. Necromancy has killed its creator more times than any other force in Warhammer history, his body scattered, burned, crushed beneath Galmaraz, and each time the Black Pyramid pulses with dark energy in the ruins of Khemri, the scattered fragments begin their long crawl back toward wholeness. The 9 books whisper to whoever holds them. The crown corrupts whoever wears it, and somewhere in the wastes between Nagash and the Desert Kingdoms, a hand made of warpstone and bone drags itself across the sand toward reunion with its master.